started by talking about the series itself, and then we'll go ahead and transition into this specific session for today. So today we are really wanting to just thank you so much for, so many of you have been part of this series since we've been doing it for the last few weeks, and you've been here, and so you're already familiar with the series. But for those of you who are new and those of you who may need a refresher, welcome to the CAAASA, UCLA, CCEE, Advancing Equity in an Era of Crisis webinar series. The California Association of African American Superintendents and Administrators, CAAASA, and the University of California, Los Angeles Center for the Transformation of Schools put this project together to support equity in virtual learning as we all shelter in place to prevent the spread of COVID-19. This work has been made possible by the generous support of the California Collaborative for Educational Excellence, CCEE. We're grateful for their partnership on behalf of California's K-12 public school students. At the end of our session today, I'm going to share a link, a survey link with you, and we really hope that you will take the time to fill out the survey. It's really important to us to be responsive to the needs of the participants. So I'll share that with you at the end. You'll also get a link to the portal where you'll be able to submit any questions that you'll be able to submit questions today, and I'll talk about that in a second. But if there happen to be any questions that arise for you after the session, or that you maybe don't get answered today, that's fine, because we have an Ask the Experts portal where you can submit your questions, and then an expert will answer your questions within 48 hours. I'll give you that link as well at the end. And then I'll also make sure that you get a link to the website where today's session resources will be available, including the recording and the slide presentation. The thing that I will say is that one of the benefits of these sessions is that not only are we benefiting from the presenters, who I will be so glad to introduce in a second, but we benefit from one another. So if you're going to share resources, please make sure that in the chat you select all panelists and participants or attendees so that everyone can see your links. So now I want to talk about today's session. So we have the pleasure of having our session today facilitated by Dr. Pedro Noguera. And the session title is What Schools Can Be, Planning for Schools After the Pandemic. And Dr. Noguera is the Distinguished Professor of Education, Faculty Director for the Center for the Transformation of Schools and UCLA Graduate School of Education and Information Studies. And Dr. Noguera, was there something else that happened with you recently? Does that capture? I think there was a transition recently. So I'll leave that up to you to talk about. But I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to you. But please, everyone, know that I'll be here monitoring the chat, and then I'll close this out at the end. So I'll pass it over to you, Dr. Noguera.
Thank you, Africa. And good afternoon, everyone. And what she was alluding to is that I'm the incoming dean of the Rossier School of Education at USC. I'll start on July 1st. So looking forward to that new role, the challenges that'll come with it, especially during this period, but also the opportunities. And that's how I'm thinking about this period for schools too, is that there are challenges, but there are also opportunities. We need to address both. So let me first just say what a pleasure it's been to work with CAAASA on this series. We planned this within a relatively short period of time, but we saw a critical need out there, a need to ensure that equity issues were being addressed, and that we gave people tools, concrete advice on how to approach those. So I just want to thank CAAASA and thank CCE for supporting us in this work, and thank all of you for tuning in today. So hopefully many of you are doing the same thing, thinking about whether or not there's any silver lining to this pandemic. We know it's had devastating consequences already on so many individuals, both from a health standpoint as well as from an economic standpoint. And those consequences are still being felt. Not far from where I live, there's a church that distributes free food, and I see the line growing every day. So I know my neighbors and many others are hurting, and that unfortunately, unless we figure out some strategies to address that, those problems won't go away. And for every adult we see in line, we know there are also families that are waiting for that person to come back with the food. So we have to recognize that many of our kids right now are experiencing food insecurity, housing insecurity, on top of the insecurities related to the virus itself. So I want to acknowledge that, because those are just some of the challenges. I also just read a report about the challenges that will face schools. And most of those focus on logistical challenges. How are we going to do social distancing in schools that were already overcrowded? How do we address the social and emotional needs of kids when we know we may not have the counselors or social workers on staff? This is not a small issue by any means, but I'm not going to address the logistics right now. That's for another topic. Instead, I'm going to focus on the educational opportunities that I believe will be created, if not immediately, then not long after this pandemic is over. So let me start with a quote. And this is a quote from Hugh Vasquez. Hugh is a colleague and a friend at the National Equity Project. He wrote an article which I'd refer you to read about this very topic, what schools can be after the pandemic. And this is the quote. He says, "Since we know that disturbance is required for change, and there's no doubt that disturbance is happening as we speak, the question is, are we willing to use this opportunity to create the kind of educational system we want? We have learned that if we are going to change a system, we as individuals first have to see what the system is producing. Then we have to engage with others to design something different. And finally, we have to act." So I want you to think about that quote for a moment, because I think it calls for us to do at least two things, well, three things. First, to recognize that going back to normal is not where we want to be. The schools, as we've known them, produce very unequal outcomes. The disparities have been very deeply entrenched in our school system and in our society for many years. And we know that even kids who seem to do well in school often are not inspired by what they experience, often have other unmet needs, social and emotional needs. As a friend of mine pointed out, who was a principal, he said that when the principals don't like school either, you know something is wrong. And unfortunately, there are lots of adult professionals out there who also are very familiar with some of the problems our systems have been faced with for a long time. At the same time, if we're going to have change, we can't just dream. We have to be kind of practical and pragmatic about how we think about change. We might wish for every child to have a healthy meal and a good night's rest and a stimulating education, and we should strive for that. But what are the short-term goals we can set that are realistic, that we can attain? And then, most of all, how do we act on that to make it happen? Because it's not good enough to have a vision unless we also have a sense of how we're going to get there. So I want to now share another quote, and this one comes from Paul Revel. Paul Revel is a colleague and friend and the former Commissioner of Education in Massachusetts. And in an article or an interview that he did today, that got released today with the Harvard Educational newsletter, he says, "How do we make our school, our education and child development systems more individually responsive to the needs of our students?" Let me emphasize that, individually responsive. Why not construct a system that meets children where they are and gives them what they need inside and outside of school in order to be more successful? Let's take this opportunity to end the one-size-fits-all factory model of education. So I want you to think about that for a moment. I would say that right now, because of the way we've thought about standards, we have standardized or attempted to standardize everything. We've focused much more on preparing kids for tests than on engaging them academically in the classroom. We haven't really tapped into their natural curiosity and haven't really found ways to thoroughly engage kids in schools. And so part of doing that does mean we have to know our kids. We have to understand who they are, how they learn, what their needs are. We've got to be creative in thinking about how to help those children to not only grow intellectually, but also in terms of their social and their emotional development as well. Now, here's the good news. There are schools that have been doing this, and we should learn from those schools. There's a school, a district, Lindsay, in the Central Valley, serves mostly kids whose parents are farm workers. And they've been doing personalized education now for several years. And they figured it out. They figured out that we can use technology as a way to meet the needs of individual learners, something that one classroom teacher has trouble on her own, or even with the support of technology. So I'm going to come back to that in a moment, because learning from success, learning from successful models is a key part of improvement. So again, the need for change is clear. Too many of our schools have emphasized control and compliance, controlling kids and sometimes controlling adults, making sure they do as they're told, And that model, I think, has not brought the best out of either the adults or the kids in many cases. We've had excessive reliance on pressure as a strategy for improvement, pressuring teachers, pressuring kids, pressuring principals, threatening them with their jobs. And by now, what we know is that failure and threats are not a great motivator. In fact, they can have the opposite effect of leading to discouragement. We know that in many of our schools, the culture of the school is too impersonal. The kids are not well known, that it's too fragmented, that what's happening in one class is not at all reinforced in another class, that adults aren't working together around a common vision, and that too often the approach to discipline is highly punitive. And we're not addressing the underlying causes of behavior problems. And then finally, we know that in too many classrooms, and I would say this is particularly true at the secondary level, there's more emphasis on covering material than there is on deep engagement, on getting kids stimulated, on using those higher order thinking skills. How often do the students come to you at the end of the day and say, wow, what an amazing day I had. That was just such powerful learning that occurred today. That should be what we're after, and that should be something that we aim for at the end of this period. So to get there, I'm going to come back to a concept that many are familiar with already, and that's the need to understand the difference between the technical and the adaptive aspects of our work. The technical aspects of our work in education consume us now. We got to figure out how to open up schools safely, how to keep them clean, how to make sure that adults and kids who are immunocompromised are not endangered, how to do social distancing. That's a huge, tall order. But that can't be all we think about. We've also got to think about how do we build communities in our schools? How do we really make sure our kids feel safe, not just safe physically, but safe emotionally and psychologically? How do we make sure that the adults feel supported so they're able to give more? All of that is what we call adaptive work. It's adaptive because it forces us to reflect on what we're doing and really ask ourselves questions like, what do we need to do to support each other? How do we build a community in our schools where people will feel appreciated? And how do we know that we're making a difference? When we start to ask these types of questions, then we know we're doing the adaptive work. And adaptive work is what we're called upon to do now, because what we thought worked before certainly won't work in the new period. So here are some technical questions I just want to put out there. And I know that the superintendents who are there and those who work in the business office are thinking about these already. How do we manage social distancing in schools that were overcrowded? How are we going to keep schools safe and sanitary, particularly with the depleted classified staff who does the cleaning? How are we going to deal with staff and students who have compromised immune systems? And if we can't bring back all students, which ones should we prioritize? I've been thinking a lot about that because we know that not every kid has been able to participate in distance learning. Some kids haven't had enough access to technology, to screens, to internet access, and some kids just don't have adult support at home, which means that their learning probably hasn't been optimal during this period. How do we prioritize those needs when we get back? So I'd say we have to start by asking this question. How are we going to support the mental health needs of kids when they get back? We know that we were faced, even before this period, with a large number of students who were depressed and anxious. Lots of adults now are also under great stress. Those issues will be compounded by that long extended period of quarantine and by the fears created by the pandemic itself. So we need to make sure we're ready and prepared to address those social and emotional needs when we return. We need to be clear about how to build a sense of community where people feel supported. We need to also make sure we have strategies to address the lost learning time, particularly amongst kids who become unmotivated and discouraged, kids who haven't picked up a book since school let out and will need to be re-engaged. How do we reclaim them as learners so that they know that school still matters, their education is still important? I'm particularly concerned about the students who will be graduating soon because they may be really discouraged about their prospects for college. How do we make sure that our leaders are clear on how to support both their staff and the students? Just focusing on the mandates that come down from the central office is not going to be good enough to create caring schools, schools where the adults feel supported And we know that when they don't feel supported, often that trickles down to the kids. So we need leaders who have social and emotional intelligence to lead staff and provide the support they'll need. And then we need to know a lot about the kids. What kind of learning did they experience while they were at home? Where might there be some gaps and losses in learning? What will the social and emotional needs be? And how can we tap into and rekindle their dreams and aspirations? All very critical questions. So let me start by talking about how do we build community? And for those of you who do this in your schools already, this will just be a refresher. For those of you who haven't, I want to encourage you to think about this. All human beings do better when they feel respected, when they feel seen and known, when they feel safe. And safety, again, is nurtured by being in a community. So I want to encourage you to start all staff meetings and all classroom meetings with a check-in. How are you doing? How are you feeling? Making sure that people have a chance to talk and express some of their concerns before we launch into a meeting or to a lesson. We have to give people a chance to air their concerns. It doesn't mean we can address everything. Sometimes we just have to simply say, I understand your fears. You'll see later, I've got some resources on to share with you on what leaders can do during a period of crisis. And one of them is to acknowledge the feelings of those we lead, and to be willing to at least name our own fears and concerns so that they don't think that we're just robots. Same time, we also spend a few days with kids hearing their stories. What was life like in quarantine? Do some group activities to get reacquainted with each other so that we feel comfortable again. Play, laugh, make sure that people feel as though coming to school again is a good thing, not punishment from the time spent at home. And then make sure there's time for physical recreation, for music, for dance. All those things, again, will make the experience of returning to school, I think, a better one for lots of us, including the adults. Some of you are familiar with this chart about why we can't treat everyone the same. The diagram to the right shows us when we focus on equity, we are focused on making things accessible. We're focusing on acknowledging the differences that we bring. This pandemic has exposed our inequities. It's also exposed the privileges that some have. Right? Those who have two college-educated parents at home, one of whom is not working, have got a huge advantage over the kids who've got parents who are out there on the front lines working every day, or who are struggling with their own anxiety issues. That's the reality we've been dealing with. So when we return, we've got to work to eliminate the barriers that get in the way of learning, the barriers that prevent our kids from feeling like they're part of the community. So what are some of the barriers that we will encounter? Well, we're going to encounter those social emotional needs. The stress, the anxiety, the uncertainty, they'll all be there. They'll all be real. And as we know, we can't divide up the intellectual part of a child and separate it from their emotional and their social needs. We've got to address the whole child. And that's got to be central to our work. We know that there are certain kids who have experienced these gaps in learning. How can we accelerate? Can we use after school? Can we use summer school? Can we use tutoring? Which kids need it? Which kids have not had the access that they needed during this period? How do we deal with the kids who just don't have the motivation now, who are discouraged, who have experienced loss during this period, loss of family members, loss of homes? How do we rekindle in them a sense of purpose, a sense of why education is important? Truth is, those kids need education now more than ever, but they also need strong, positive relationships with adults if they're going to appreciate the importance of education in their lives. And so I want to acknowledge what the barriers are, and then we've got to figure out, okay, how do we strategize to deal with them? So I want you to keep in mind a few things about equity. Equity is premised on the idea that we have to give kids what they need to be successful and recognize that they have differences. They come to us with different needs, different temperament, different strengths and challenges. And so we've got to first acknowledge them, and then we've got to respond to them. And we respond to them by again, creating the context where we can listen to kids, hear their stories, hear their concerns, so that they know we are, in fact, concerned and care about them. Equity is also about a commitment to fairness. And we've got to see that in all aspects. We've got to see educational leaders who treat their staff with a sense of fairness. And we've got to see teachers, frontline teachers and instructional aides who are recognizing the needs of their students and responding to those. And then most of all, equity has to be accompanied by a willingness to speak out when we see injustice, and a willingness to let those in authority know when we see kids being denied basic learning opportunities. We've got to do all that, because if we don't, what we will see is the most vulnerable and the most disadvantaged kids will be the ones who will lose out the most, even after school returns. It can't be about lowering the expectations or the standards. Now, this is, I know, something we got to be careful with, because we know it's not good enough to just raise the bar. Equity is about making high standards accessible, making learning meaningful, making sure, for example, that if we assign homework, that the kids understand how to do the work, which sounds obvious, but homework only works if it's work that begins when the children are with us, and we have a chance to see them at work and see them apply what they've learned. So we need to really be clear about how to make high standards available. We also need to make sure that we don't lower the bar just because of poverty. Poverty is an issue, especially now, because we know that a lot of basic needs not being met, but we know that poor kids with the right supports can achieve, can learn, must be challenged, right? Must be held to high standards. We know that equity issues show up in all kinds of schools, including schools that are more diverse and schools that serve affluent kids. There are equity issues there too. There are a lot of kids right now who come from middle-class families, but their parents are too busy to do online learning with them, so they're left to fend for themselves quite a bit. So we've got to be clear about what equity isn't, otherwise it'll just become nothing more than a slogan. So what should be different after the pandemic? Now, if we had the time, and we're going to produce an equity guide where we give more detailed information down the line, but we want to tailor education developmentally to the needs of our students. We want to make sure that what the kids are exposed to is meaningful, and that they're allowed to engage in some active learning, and that it's relevant to their lives. What do I mean by that? Part of what I'm getting at is, do kids see how what they learn this week relates to what they're going to learn the following week? Do they understand how to apply what they've learned? Do they understand how to use that information in ways that are relevant to their lives? That is even more important now, because there's so many kids who are discouraged. So the idea of cultural relevance and social relevance has got to be right at the heart of what we're doing. We've got to put relationships at the center of our work, because we know there are lots of kids, if they're not taught by adults they know care about them, will choose not to learn from them. They may not come back at all. And so fostering positive, strong, healthy relationships with kids where caring is at the center is key, and especially now. We've got to maintain that focus on the whole child. We've got to provide opportunities for collaboration amongst adults who can plan together on lessons, who can look at student work together, give each other feedback on what they're doing. Too often, adults work in isolation, and this period of quarantine has reinforced that isolation. When we come back, we need to make sure that teachers get to collaborate and work together in planning meaningful lessons. And I would say the same is true for kids. Many kids have been deprived of the social contact. And if we can create learning opportunities for them to learn together, to work together, for many kids, this will be a real benefit, especially if they're given clear guidance on how to work together, on how to study together, and how to plan and present together. So I want to encourage that we see collaboration as a strategy that we employ from a pedagogical standpoint. And then the learning's got to develop higher order thinking skills. It's got to encourage kids to think critically, so that they are getting good at looking for the sources, understanding the sources of information that they draw upon, that they don't just accept what they're told. that they know when they're reading a text, what kinds of questions to pose when they're reading that text. That when they're writing, that they're not just repeating what they've heard, but really their voice is present in what they're writing. And so I want to encourage you to tap into those higher order skills, develop assignments and projects that get kids to think deeply about what they're doing, what they're learning, and how it should be applied. And then ultimately, we want to help kids develop a sense of mastery. I'm a real proponent of project-based learning because I think it brings all of this together. When kids can produce something that demonstrates what they've learned and show it to others, it really is a great way, not only for them to instill a sense of pride in their work, but for you as the educators to see what they've done and to know whether or not they've truly learned the material. One of the things I did early on in this pandemic, my daughter and I have an 8-year-old at home. She was doing a biography of Michelle Obama. And together we did research on Michelle Obama. We read from her book, Becoming. We went online to look at online sources to hear speeches by her and to see interviews. And together then we pulled together a very comprehensive biography. We did it in the format that included, it was multimedia with pictures and with segments that cut to her speeches. I learned as much as she did in the process. And so I want to encourage you to think about ways in which you can build into your learning activities opportunities for kids to get a full range of learning experiences and to demonstrate and to experience a sense of mastery in what they do. So to get this to happen, we've got to work on building the capacity of our staff. And I know that we didn't have enough time to do this prior to the pandemic. It came upon us too quickly. We didn't even have a chance to even prepare teachers on how to use the technology, or much less to do meaningful lessons that were done through Zoom or other devices. But now we know. Now we know, and so now we know that we're going to probably have a hybrid model. Some kids learning virtually, some kids learning in school. How do we make sure that we provide professional development to our staff that's tailored to their needs? We need to make sure it's responsive to their needs. So we need to ask teachers, what do you need to do this work effectively? What kinds of supports will help you to make your classrooms come to life for your students? Can teachers share lessons with each other so that they can improve together? So I want to encourage you to make sure that we provide differentiated professional development to teachers. Our teachers are just like our students. They come to us with different needs. They come to us with different strengths, and we need to make sure we are tailoring it to their needs and building on their strengths. We also need to figure out who will we need to partner with in the post-pandemic period. Are there nonprofits we should work with to address some of the social and the health needs that kids bring? I work with schools that work with educators. Educator does great work around the social emotional needs of schools. But there are lots of groups that do this work. Communities and Schools is another. We need to make sure that we have partners so that schools are not left on their own to figure out how to address these complex social and emotional needs that kids bring. It's going to be very important that the central offices engage in what I will describe as collaborative problem solving with the school leaders. That is, rather than just telling them what to do, listen to them, hear what their challenges are. We're in this together. And when we create a basis for dialogue and for two-way communication, then together, hope we come up with better solutions to the problems we face. And all of that requires trust, a high degree of trust, so that the site leaders, that the teachers know that if they raise questions, they're not going to get slammed. We're going to listen. We're going to try to figure this out together because we're all in this together. And so I wanted to encourage you to adopt a capacity building approach to your school, to your district, because it is only by acknowledging that we are learning together, that we're in kind of unknown territory here, that we will figure this out and get through it better than we were. So the areas where the capacity building will most likely be needed include what I've talked about already, whole child focus. Many teachers don't know how to address non-academic needs of kids, how to build those relationships. how to handle kids who have experienced stress, anxiety. Some kids may have experienced neglect because their parents have been away or not engaged. And so knowing our kids, making sure that we are drawing on resources to support us in this work will be essential. We also know that some teachers are going to need some training on how to continue to improve in the distance learning. Sending worksheets home is not good enough for lots of kids. The work needs to be meaningful. The learning needs to be meaningful. We need to get better and better at using the technology so that it's an effective tool. Right now, think about this. Most of us can learn anything we want through YouTube. So we need to make sure that our learning is even better than YouTube, that it is clear, that it provides practical guidance on how to do things to our students and to our staff. We're still going to have a need for cultural competence in figuring out how do we reach families? How do we raise questions that might be seen as sensitive or invasive of a person's privacy? It's very important that we not make assumptions about families and their needs, or how we can be of help to them, but really to let them know, I'm here for you, I'm here to work with you and support you, let me know what you need, and I'll do my best, if I can't provide it, to connect you with those who can. Being sensitive to cultural differences is going to be very important if we're going to make sure that our schools feel inclusive and feel supportive to a broad range of students. And then we're going to have to continue to move away from a focus on compliance, both with adults and with kids, and towards a focus on empowerment. Our teachers have to be empowered to deliver lessons, which means they need to know what does a strong lesson online look like? How do I make use of the tools available to me when I'm in the school, in the classroom, so that when the precious time I have with my kids is used well. Same way we're going to have to do with students. It's not enough to tell them what to do. We have to give them a chance to work actively on their projects in class so we can see them learning. And when they're learning at home, we need to make sure that the work is meaningful and that we're giving constructive feedback so the work can improve. Right now, it's more important than ever to put less emphasis on the grade, more emphasis on the learning. Not to say grades are unimportant, but what we need to make sure that it's not a shortchange for feedback. Kids need meaningful feedback on the work they turn in. They need clear advice on how to improve the quality of work they submit to us, because the real learning is not in the first submission, but in the revision. And getting kids to revise the work multiple times to get it to improve is a great way for them to learn, to become persistent, and to expect the best of themselves. We have to be careful about the way we think in terms of interventions. And I know that there's a tendency to think that simply more time is enough. And here I want to caution you that it's the quality of the learning time that matters most, not just the amount of time. So we have to make sure that summer learning is not a punishment, but really thought of as a way to keep kids engaged, keep kids connected, get kids doing things that keep them learning so that we minimize the effects of the learning loss. If you can get kids doing a lot more independent reading and writing, for example, that'll have a big effect. And that can happen without a whole lot of screen time. So I want to encourage you to make sure that when we think about interventions, we make sure those are quality supports for kids, not simply busy work, and that we're doing things that actually do result in growth for kids, particularly kids who've been behind. For our students with IEPs who may have been more neglected because we could not provide the support they needed at home, we need to make sure that we're really doing our best to tailor instructional support to their needs. We might need to revisit the IEP to make sure that, that what we provide is timely and in line with their current needs. And we need to make sure that parents are involved so they're aware that we know what their children need and that we're listening to those parents about what kinds of support they think their children need. And then we've got to get good at identifying and supporting kids that we know are struggling. the kids who've been missing lots of time. Some districts are able to keep track, not just of who has a screen and internet access, but are they actually learning? Are they actually connected? Are they actually turning into work? This is very important because, again, we want real evidence that kids are learning and that the support we're providing is paying off. So these are some resources I'd like to share. I mentioned a quote already from Paul Revel. That was the Harvard Ed Review newsletter. This one was a really great resource for superintendents about what we can learn from the countries that have already started reopening schools, how they've done it, what mistakes they've made, what we can learn from those mistakes. The Learning Policy Institute has a number of great resources on their site that you can learn from. I read this piece last week, Leading Through Anxiety, on the Harvard Business Review site. And what I found particularly useful was the author's suggestion that instead of faking it, we need to embrace our own challenges and acknowledge them and demonstrate a high level of social and emotional intelligence on our part, because it's hard to lead others if we are just putting up a front and not acknowledging how difficult this whole experience has been. Our parents are going to continue to need guidance and support on how to support their kids. And this resource, Pandemic Parenting, New York Times has done a series over the last several weeks, each week, for parents. That's a great resource of things parents can do at home to help their kids. Many parents report that there are advantages that they're experiencing because it's brought them closer together with their children. They're seeing up close what their kids are doing. And it's helped them to understand how to be more supportive of their children. So let's treat parents as a resource. Let's keep them connected even when we return. We want to find ways to keep kids engaged. And so this resource, Staying Engaged During the Coronavirus, is a good one. And you can get that one. Also, you can get all of these on my Facebook page, Pedro Noguera, PhD. And there's links to these sites. This one I found particularly useful because it was about how to keep kids intellectually and academically engaged while they're still in quarantine. Supporting online learning during the pandemic was a great one, and then as was the other one from a homeschooling expert. We have institutions that have been doing online learning for some time. They know how to do it well. I think particularly for teachers who have struggled with this, I'd encourage you to tap into these resources and to look and see what we can learn from those who've been doing it longer, and draw upon the tools that they recommend they make available. And then lastly, this one piece, mental health wellness tips for quarantine and beyond, is really important. It gives good practical suggestions for adults and kids on how to address some of the mental health challenges that have come up during this period. Everything from why it's important to live with a routine and schedule, for making sure that we take breaks regularly to give kids some physical activity and not too much screen time. We need to make sure that we are as concerned about the mental health of our students and our staff as we are with their academic progress. So those are just a few sites. I want to open it up for questions. First question I want to pose to you is, at least to think about, is what steps should your school district take to prepare for the reopening of schools beyond the logistics? What are you doing to get your staff ready? What are you doing to make sure you're going to be prepared to build capacity in the areas where it's needed? And what strategies are you going to use to build a sense of community and help people feel comfortable again when we return to school? These, I think, are all really, really important questions. As I said, we can use this as a chance to make schools better than they were. But there's no guarantee that will happen unless we put thought into it. And so I encourage you now to reach out to your colleagues, think about how we can approach this work differently, so that when we return, schools can be even better than they were before at meeting the needs of our students. So let me stop there and open up the lines for some questions via the chat room, and I'll be happy to respond.
right, wonderful. Thank you so much. I've been monitoring the questions coming through the chat, and I have a list of a few. So let me start out with the first question that was shared a while ago. What kinds of hard decisions do we need to make to elevate best teaching practices to meet our kids where they are? What does educator support and coaching look like?
So one of the hard decisions, and this is a real equity concern, is who teaches who. Um, in too many schools, it's been our newest, least experienced teachers teaching our most challenging kids. We do that for a variety of reasons, but very little evidence that it's helpful to the kids or to the adults. So that's the first tough question is who's going to teach whom? And how do we make sure that teachers who are teaching the kids who are furthest behind get the supports they need so that they are not set up to fail? So that's just one huge question I would raise. I think in addition, there's the question of how do we provide the personalization that's needed? What are some models we can draw from? I know from in the past, we used to call on teachers, for example, to differentiate instruction, but we often gave teachers very little guidance on how to do that effectively. We can't make that mistake again. We've got to show and learn from examples of personalization and demonstrate how that can be done effectively in our schools. What was the second part of that question?
All right, so what does educator support and coaching look like?
I think it really looks like a two-way street. It looks like giving the staff a chance to raise questions, express their concerns. No question is a dumb question. We need to be willing to entertain them, be willing to provide the support that we can. Teachers can help each other too if you create a setting where that's more likely. So create groups where teachers can connect, particularly teachers who are teaching the same subject, the same grade level. They need to work together, plan together, share together, and a lot of that can be done online and virtually. So I'd really encourage that because I think that, as we all know, in too many schools, teachers work in isolation from each other. We have one teacher who is doing really amazing work, creative as can be, right next door to a teacher who's struggling. And we need to change that too.
All right, thank you for your answer to that question. Another question is, how can the schools create space for parents, families, and caregivers to learn and adjust to the new formats of learning presented in our schools?
Well, I think we're going to have to do workshops aimed specifically at the parents about what they can do to support their own kids. We need to figure out how do we reach the parents. I participated in some of those already. I participated in an event put on by a community organization aimed at parents about how do we talk to the kids about college during this period. We got over 1,000 parents showed up for that. I think parents are eager to hear what they can do to be supportive of their own children. We need to make sure we reach out in the languages that they speak. We need to make sure that the material is accessible, is in a language that they can discern and comprehend. But we need to do it as directly as possible because there are a lot of parents who know, based on this experience, that they've got to play a leading role. They've got to be actively involved with their kids. It's no longer good enough to think I could just send my kid to school and they'll do the rest. Parents have to play a role.
All right, thank you for that. Another question is, how can we check for engagement if we remain in a virtual or hybrid format? I'm assuming they're talking about the students' engagement in our new normal that's upon us.
So this is a challenge. One of the things that I've done, and I'd encourage you all to do, I ask my students when I'm teaching them, I taught a class today at UCLA, I ask them to let me see you. Let me see your face. Don't just show your name or a picture of yourself. I need to see you so that we can connect at least visibly. Makes a difference for our own personal accountability when we have to show up. And don't let a bad hair day be an excuse for showing up and being seen. But beyond that, I think work on rebuilding the relationship. The relationship is key. We know kids will work for people they know care about them. And so spending time to check in with them, making sure, asking how it's going, how's your family doing, all that demonstrates real care. Tell them about yourself, what you're doing during this quarantine that has made you feel a sense of joy. Will also help in building that relationship again.
I so agree with you, right? All right, so the next question is, because we've been talking about the importance of relationship building with students and families, because relationships are so important, do you recommend looping with students? And obviously I know that's probably more possible, right, in the elementary grades than with secondary, but when we're thinking about where it's possible to loop, would you recommend looping for the
I would, because of the relationship factor. Continuity in relationships really makes a difference. And knowing the kids, and the fact that they know you, especially because last year was interrupted. If we can keep the kids together by looping, I think that would be a great asset and reduce some of the anxiety our kids are experiencing because of this pandemic and because of the uncertainty that's arisen with it.
Alrighty. I know you mentioned a little bit earlier, we were talking about the Lindsay School District. This question I think is a bit similar in the sense that it's asking, are there any models that have done what we're talking about well, that we can use as best practices? The person shared that they would appreciate some guidance on UDL and distance learning. Any case studies that we can use as a reference would be much appreciated. So any examples that you can think of that would be like exemplars for us to kind of help to model our practices after?
So I'll put in my written responses, I'll include more on distance learning. But for now, I would recommend checking out the Buck Institute on project-based learning. They have great resources for both distance learning and project-based learning through virtual learning medium that you can draw upon. So check them out. They have a treasure trove of resources.
One of the other questions is, what are some best practices for supporting English learners, students who are English learners during distance learning?
So this is one of the places where personalization can be really, really valuable. There's a district in New Jersey, Union City, that has been doing personalization for English learners for a long time. And what they can do is they use iPads, each kid, so that it meets the child exactly where they are developmentally in their language acquisition, their language development. And there's other software. There's a software called by a group called EPGY, the Educational EPGY, Educational Program for Gifted Learners. And they have tools for English learners. They're particularly good for math, but they also have tools for literacy, and it's all personalized. And so I would say that for our English learners, personalization is going to be key because we don't know, again, about the learning gaps or about the kind of support they have available to them at home.
Thank you. All right, so this question is making reference to differentiation. We were talking about that a bit earlier. So this question is talking about differentiation in both process and products as a norm. That's something we've been talking about for a long time. And what do we leverage now to make that a reality for our kids with regard to differentiation?
Well, I would say differentiation and personalization are going to go together. Personalization is a higher form of differentiation. Now, again, that takes a lot more work for the teacher because you're giving, if you have a personalized approach to instruction, you're giving personalized feedback, individual feedback. So that's hard. So I want to acknowledge that. At the same time, I think that if we get kids accustomed to turning in work on a regular basis and providing them with feedback on what they've done, then what we do is we start to instill in our students the idea that the real learning is not in just turning something in, it's in making those revisions and improving upon the quality of the work and turning in their very best work. So I would encourage you, again, to, there's some great tools for this. Linda Christensen's written a book called Critical Friends, and it's all about how teachers can work together to provide meaningful feedback to students. And I could name some other tools as well that you could utilize. Marzano has some good tools on this as well.
Oh, definitely, definitely. Another question is, could you recommend any teacher coaching programs that folks could engage with during the summertime? Are you aware of any coaching that might be available for educators?
So the National Equity Project has some coaching. They mostly partner with districts, but they offer very high quality coaching to school districts. I actually serve on their board, and I know from many years of working with them that the work they do is very good. The other coaching services I'm aware of are more regional. For those in the LA area, there's LAEP. They provide great coaching services to schools they work with. I'd have to think some more about others.
I think this is a question probably a lot of people are thinking about. How do we engage in bargaining? How do we engage bargaining units in a conversation about adaptive change?
That's a tough one.
I know, right? I'm gonna put that out there, but
well, it's a tough one because we know the financial situation is going to be tough, and we don't control so much. The state, I think, is trying to do their best. I keep sending the message back to the state: you can't reopen the economy if schools are not reopened and made whole. And so we have to advocate for fair funding to schools, and then we have to make sure that when we get that funding, that we are treating our staff fairly. But we're again in unknown territory, and so there's got to be transparency, both on the nature of the constraints created by the budget, but also we have to work with people so that people feel as though they've been respected and treated fairly as our staff. Some staff are not going to feel comfortable coming back into schools because of their own health, and others are more willing. So how do we not punish people for their health needs?
I totally agree. All right, so a lot of the other comments that are in chat are just a lot of like amening and supporting what's been said, and a lot of appreciations to you for what you've shared so far. A lot of folks have asked about the access to the resources, and I'll share that shortly. But just wanted to let you know that as far as like questions go, those were the questions that I had collected. So I didn't know if you had something you wanted to say in closing before I give the last closing piece.
So I encourage you to read that whole article by Hugh Vasquez that he wrote. I'll send a link to that too, on what schools can be. And I think part of what he's raising is that when we have a disruption like this, it gives us a chance to start to think differently. So how many of you are thinking differently about your own relationship to your families, right? Hopefully you're spending a lot more time together. You're eating meals together because you can't go out. You're cooking. And you're more intentional, hopefully, about the things that you prioritize. I think that's the approach we've got to take to the reopening of school. What do we really value? What matters most? How do we make sure we give time and attention to those things? How do we make sure that we treat each other with dignity and respect and create schools that are truly caring and humane places? These are the things that we should be working toward. It won't just happen. We have to start thinking about them now and planning to implement them when we return to operation. So these are trying times that we're in. I think none of us should minimize how difficult this period is. There's many lives lost, and there are many people now under great stress because of this pandemic. But I do believe we'll get through it. The question is, will we come through it better, or will we go back to the world as we knew? The world as we knew was not sustainable. Too many of us had lives that were crazy. We were commuting long hours. We were away from our children and our families. We were compromising our health because of our work schedules. We need to strive for some balance. We need to strive for positive, healthy relationships with the people we love and care about. And we need to make sure that we're doing this work in education with a sense of clarity and purpose and passion. Education is still the best resource we have for creating a better, more just society. And I encourage all of you to approach your work as educators with that goal in mind.
Well, thank you so, so much. This has been such a rich and helpful session. I'm not even in the area, right? I'm outside of Boston, but I'm so excited about all that's being shared during these sessions because my husband and I have a son who's a junior in high school and a daughter who is she's a senior, she's about to graduate, and whatever that means, right, for her as she moves on to college. And thank you so much for all that you've shared. I'm about to drop the link to the survey in the chat, so you'll all see that come through in a second. So that's the link that I just sent in just now, so that will be really great and helpful if you would be willing to fill that out. The next link that I'm going to put in is what I referred to earlier in the session, where if you have additional questions or things that, as you marinate on what we've talked about here, if you have additional questions, you can go to this website. It's the Ask the Experts portal. You'll be able to submit your questions there. And then finally, as many of you have been asking for, there is the link that I'll put in. The third link is the link to where the session resources will be found. Just give us a little bit of time because we want to make sure we have a chance to upload the recording and the resources that Dr. Noguera just talked about. So you'll be able to find those there. But I just really wanted to say thank you so much to all of you for spending this time together. And
can I read this last quote?
Oh yeah, please,
Yep.
please do.
Okay.
Please do. Yeah.
So this, again, is a quote from that article I mentioned by Paul Revel. And he says, the best that can come of this is a new paradigm shift in terms of the way in which we look at education. Think about a paradigm is not simply a program. A paradigm is a whole way in which we think about the enterprise of education. Since children's well-being and success depend on more than just schooling, we need to look holistically at the entirety of children's lives. They need a wide array of essential supports and opportunities outside of school. These education prerequisites go far beyond the purview of school systems, but rather are the responsibility of communities and society at large. In order to learn, children need equal access to healthcare, food, clean water, stable housing, and out-of-school enrichment opportunities. We have to reconceptualize the whole job of child development and education and construct systems that meet children where they are and give them what they need, both inside and outside of school, in order for all of them to have a genuine opportunity to be successful. So that's our goal. That's what we should aim for. And that's a goal that goes beyond education, beyond school, to our society as a whole. So I wish you all the best. That's what we should be aiming for, and we should deserve nothing less. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. I hope you have a really great rest of the day. And if you attend any of the other sessions, I'll probably see you in a couple of different sessions. So thanks, everyone, and have a great rest of the day. Thank you, Dr. Noguera.
Thank you.